Morning all. This game that I'd like to show you this morning is very important from a stylistic perspective. The Evolution of Style series has covered a lot of Nimzo because he was quite influential with the book My System and also the inventor of the Nimzo-Indian system. We have here a game from the Liege tournament which Tartakower excelled and won this tournament, but Sultan Karl came ahead of the great Nimzo himself, and not only that, seemed to emulate Nimzovich's style of play, his very system. One of the most dramatic games where Nimzo faced the system himself was against Capablanca, where Nimzo was left without counterplay in the advanced Caracan variation and counter, covered in the Evolution of Style series. But what of Sultan Karl playing like Nimzo? Do we have any evidence that this occurred? Well, this game I present to you, I'd like to ask for your opinion in the comments of this video if you felt that Sultan Karl was playing with Nimzovich's My System in effect, and this was played in 1930. We see after d4 Sultan Karl playing the Nimzo-Indian system with c4 e6 here, and after knight c3 we do get to see the pin. No Queen's Indian here, the pin variation, the Nimzo-Indian proper. So here Rubinstein's move e3 was played, and Mir plays b6, so he's interested in central control, the e4 square in particular. Okay, he's not rushing to double the pawns. We see now bishop d3, bishop b7, knight f3, and now both sides castle. And here he does voluntarily give up his bishop to damage white's pawn structure. Now you might argue, okay, he's used the Nimzo-Indian, but to play like Nimzo, to really appreciate Nimzovich's My System, he's going to have to try and remove counterplay using the double pawn complex and using some of the principles of restrain, blockade, destroy and prophylaxis in general. So will this be evident from this game? Well, first we see knight e4, which does mean that it makes it possible for black to try and get a grip on the e4 square. That's his first concern at the moment, not blockading the double pawns. We see after queen c2 now f5. Okay, now white, if white leaves this bishop is not looking too great in this structure. So although white has the bishop head, black's grip on the e4 square is evident, and white contests that with knight d2. Okay, here Mir just moves his knight back to f6, and it looks as though, well, what has he achieved? White now tries to liberate his position by playing f3, trying to get more space in the centre with a knight at e4, and try and activate this bishop on c1. We see now the move d6, which does slightly weaken e6, but it means that the knight can come to d7. And more importantly, there's in reserve, black can play for c5 for a kind of restraint on the double pawn complex coming up. We see the move e4, okay, and Mir takes on e4, and white takes with the knight, and white might now be threatening either knight g5 or bishop g5. Knight g5 is actually a double attack on e6 and h7. So perhaps this explains Mir's next move. He wants to deprive white of the g5 square here. So he plays h6. This bishop does seem to be somewhat activated, at least on this diagonal. So white seems to have improved this position a little bit. Now knight g3 means that maybe there's going to be a frontal attack on e6 soon as well. But what of this bishop here? Is it still a problem piece within this structure? Knight bd7 is played, and now bishop a3. And then this moves c5. So for the moment, it looks as though this is very nice restraint and keeping the bishop as a bad piece here. Perhaps the bishop should have maintained itself on this diagonal, being content to live on this diagonal. But you can always move back to c1, one would expect. Queen e2, okay, rook e8, rook fe1 is now played. And now Mir plays knight f8. And the bishop does indeed return to this diagonal. It's the problem piece for white in this structure. Okay, we have the double pawns restraint. You might not think this is Nimzovichian to a great extent at the moment, but it's a pleasant position for black. Will black be able to create very nice knights from this structure. One of the techniques as well, paradoxically you might say, against double pawns is sometimes to undouble them to get mighty knights as a side effect. That's a great transitional technique. You don't always have to try and, for example, win c4. You can put pressure on c4 in the Nimzo-Indian, and there's standard manoeuvres in the Nimzo-Indian, like this knight would sometimes be on a5 hitting c4, this bishop and this queen would sometimes come to a4. But here Sultan Khan's obviously put a lot of priority on his kingside safety, so he's put a knight here rather than try and exploit the double pawn complex like that. But there's other ways of exploiting the complex here, and one way is to sort of voluntarily dissolve it, to try and activate the knights more aggressively. We see now rook c8, bishop e3, and a clue that c4 is a target, bishop a6. So tying down the queen. If the queen moves, well, it's got to be careful now if c takes and then bishop takes. So rook ed1. So there's some prophylaxis evident in black's play. And now this move is prophylaxis against potential problems on the d5. White wanted to take away from the centre just to expose this d6 pawn as a problem. And in fact, that's the very thing that white does now. But he is damaging his structure somewhat. So d takes c5 is played. B takes c5. Okay. Bishop f4 now. Okay, so d6 is a target, and white's actually tactically threatening to take and bishop h7 winning the queen. So rook d7. So both these pawns, okay, there's frontal pressure being exerted, but they're parried at the moment. And you might think, well, how is white's double pawn complex being exploited here? Rook ab1, queen a5 hitting c3, that's protected. And also, of course, a2 has to be protected as well. The knights here are just defensive for king safety, but here we have it. You might think this is a little bit silly, because as soon as you dissolve these, surely you're opening up the position more and you're activating this bishop more, potentially, along the diagonals. But this is the very move now that Mir does, is interesting conceptually from this perspective. He does indeed play d5. And you might not think this is a way of exploiting double pawns, but as I say, the side effects often of double pawns, you get mighty knights. And we see here also white being robbed of the bishop pair as well. So white did play c takes d5, and we see bishop takes d3, white losing the bishop pair, rook takes d5, and now knight takes d5, not minding a seemingly weak pawn. White's got his fair share of weak pawns, but now even c4 is ruled out here because of knight b4, it would seem. But also this bishop's attacked. Maybe more relevant is the bishop is attacked as well, because there's no pin here. This knight's protecting d7. Okay, so white wants to play perhaps for c4. He plays bishop d2, threatening c4. But now, of course, c4 from black keeps this bishop boxed in by its own structure, by its pawn on c3. So we have a situation in this position where this knight's pretty strong, and you could argue this could have counted as a Nimzo-Indian, very fluently played Nimzo-Indian by Nimzovich himself. You could argue at this point. e5, and this activates, gives the knight e6 to play potentially. Knight f6. The rook goes back. Okay, and we see rook cd8, and this control of the d file is another beautiful side effect. Then it's kind of backfired. The d takes c5 of white earlier has really backfired. That black controls that d file, and this c4 pawn is very useful for marking out the d3 square in particular. The queen also holds on to e5 here, so there's no real problems, it seems, for black. Black is achieving this prophylaxis, this state of security, positional security, that Nimzovich has really emphasized with my system. But maybe it's really just the hallmark of most positional players that they do want to reduce the counterplay of the opponents. So prophylaxis in the wider sense of offering positional security is evident perhaps in all positional players, not just Nimzovich, and clearly is evident here in Mir Sultan Khan's position. He's got a very nice position. Visually, Sultan Khan is a very calm player, never like flustered or seemingly working hard. But he's very, this calmness, but can stem from this style of chess of being positionally calm. Because if you haven't got too much to worry about for the opponent's counterplay, and you can see the opponent counterplay being turned off, switched off, then of course you're also going to be more relaxed. You're not going to have to be tensely working out loads and loads of tactical variations. And here white's counterplay is gradually being reduced. So we see knight f5. Okay, are there some tactical tricks here with the knight on f5? It is a dangerous location, but we've got two knights here defending the king. Is there potential for, say, bishop h6? Mir actually moves his king here to h8, and we see bishop e1, as though maybe, okay, maybe the bishop can be activated like this or attack e5. Now the knight comes in quite strong with knight e6, so being able to shield against this pawn being attacked with knight f4, bishop g3, and now knight f4. And that's actually snapped off now. Bishop takes f4, e takes f4. So that pawn's no longer isolated on that file. It was a bit of a structural liability if you look at this position. But with knight f4, white is not really, is more worried perhaps now about knight d3s as well. That would be a huge knight on d3 and make this e5 irrelevant, this structural problem irrelevant. So it was taken off here. So black is solving structural issues. The queen's also now tied down because this queen's now attacking the knight, can't move away from defending that knight at the moment. White plays now rook b e1, and we see a direct tactical threat with rook d3. Not the piece that just moved, but what's activated, made more effectual, is this queen is now attacking the knight. So okay, rook e5 defending the knight, attacking the queen. Now Mir reacts with rook 8 d5. Okay, and does white hasn't got an exchange sack or anything. The knight's covering e8 quite effectively. This queen's been stopped from being a menace on this diagonal. This pawn is showing its usefulness in this position. White plays knight e7, a forcing move. Okay. And we see now it's relying on a tactical trick, in fact, that white is not losing a rook because there'll be knight g6 check at the end of this, forking king and queen. So rook takes e5, rook takes e5, that's immune because of knight g6 check. But what are the traces of the counterplay removal from earlier? Well, if you look at black's pieces, structurally, black's doing very well. White's really got just as many weaknesses as black. It's symmetrical, in fact, in terms of pawn structure weaknesses or strengths. But this rook is quite active. The queen's quite active. This knight has got some opportunities, as we're about to see. And this diagonal is slightly weakened as well. Maybe white's king safety can be argued as slightly worse here. This diagonal is used with queen b6 check. And there's already some problems evident. For example, back row problems. If king h1, then maybe queen d6, just attacking the rook and the back row. And if the rook stumbled back, then rook d2. So this d file is very dangerous for white. White plays actually king f1 here. He feels that's safer. That might actually be losing, and we'll check that out in the second pass. So the previous positional play seems to have given black better position overall, with less king safety concerns. And we see the move now, queen d6. So horrible threats now of, say, check or rook d2 are evident. The back row is defended. And now this might seem an unusual move to king h7, going straight into the pin, immobilizing the rook. Okay, but what's the reason for this? We'll see. Queen b1, maintaining the pin on the rook. And we see voluntarily, if white wants an exchange of queens, queen b6. But if white did take, then that would leave c3 as a vulnerability. And if this knight ever moved, then we have knight d5 hitting c3. So white's not particularly keen in this position to exchange queens. He plays queen c1, which unpins the rook, in fact, which might be handy. But the queen is attacking f4. And this next move not only defends f4, but it also introduces some forcing move possibilities, which need to be factored in. The queen now returns back to pinning the rook, and we see now the move queen c5, a subtle improvement here with queen c5. So what is going on with this move? Okay, queen b1, and now all is revealed in this position. Can you guess what Mir Sultan Karl played here, if I give you 10 seconds, or you may want to pause the video starting from now. Okay, he plays the forcing move knight g3 check. The previous positional play had got this great position, but you know, he's not just a positional player, he can see good forcing combinations as well. And this is a very nice forcing combination. The queen moving from b6 to c5 introduced possibilities of the queen coming across. And now we see after hg, fg, this is very useful, that the queen is not only threatening mate, but a natural defense, for example rook e2 or queen c2, might be answerable with queen h5. And as Kasparov has mentioned, you know, a pawn around the opponent's king is like an attacking piece. This is acting as though it's an attacking piece. And we see this now. Queen c2, we see the move queen h5. And you might think, what is the major threat? Well, this rook is controlling these squares, in particular this one. So the major threat is now check and taking here and sometimes winning the queen. And in fact, white felt he was so helpless in this position that he resigned. Let's check out some potential defensive ideas just to see if white's position is really hopeless. To start off with, king g1 is not helped. Black just plays queen h2 using that pawn. Check. And this is actually mate. The rook's also cutting the king off in the center. So that doesn't help. If the king tries to walk, queen h2, and this is not looking too pleasant. If rook g1, that just queen takes g1. How does white defend here? Again, it's pretty hopeless. White can try sacrificing the queen, that's pretty hopeless. So it's actually fairly clear cut after queen h5 that white position is hopeless. If rook e2, then again queen h1, that's mate in fact. So it's an entirely hopeless position. So a nice forcing sequence culminating black's positional play. But let's look at the game again. So just, I'm not sure I emphasise this, but Karl Oscar Ahues, the player with white, was the Berlin champion in 1910, German champion in 1929, awarded the IM title in 1950 at the age of 66. He was on the German Olympiad team in 1930, 31 and 36. His son Herbert, born in 1922, became a Grandmaster for chess compositions. So this is a great player with white, but was positionally, he was outplayed in a kind of Nimzo-Indian style. And from our Evolution of Style series, we don't want to just cover the World Championship matches, we want to see style and its evolution. And this is a very surprising character in the history of the game, that he was a very powerful top 10 player in this tournament, coming even ahead of the great Nimzo himself, and from a stylistic perspective seemingly emulating many of Nimzovich's prophylaxis and counterplay removal strategies, playing this opening, it seems, with some degree of fluency. So doubling the pawns, the f5 move here, encouraging white to potentially weaken this diagonal, try and evict this knight, which later we saw devastating consequences of. It does help liberate the bishop on c1, but there's some weaknesses for black to pick on later, permanent weaknesses in white's position. But the dynamism of white and the two bishops needs to be reduced. So some precautionary measures here. White is threatening knight g5, h6 against knight g5. Okay, what is white threatening here? Well, this e6 pawn is a bit of a liability, so provision needs to be made perhaps for e5 if needed. Okay, so bishop a3, c5, and the engine actually likes, I think, bishop pairs and bishops in general, and actually gives white an advantage here, technically. But if it's easier to play for black from a human point of view, we often see the evaluation slowly coming down in practice. So here, rook e8. Okay, white does have that bishop pair though. Knight f8, bishop c1, rook c8. And white's starting to be feeling a little bit tied down, feeling the pressure potentially of the c4 pawn. Bishop e3, bishop a6. A nice move here, bishop a6, and one the engine actually likes here. starting to tie down the queen a bit. Okay, so if the queen moves, we can imagine c takes and bishop c4 in some cases. And now with this move you see the evaluation really coming down. What is white's actual active plan here? You only suggest straight away taking on c5 in fact. Does this really keep white's position alive? If the bishop tried to be a nuisance, again these knights can start springing into life, and we see a climb down of evaluation. It could be that modern engines slightly overestimate in certain circumstances the power of the bishops over the knights, especially with double pawns around. Even if the double pawns are dissolved, sometimes the knights just get better and better, and this might be one of those cases. In the game, in fact, the knights start getting quite magnificent. After d takes, b takes. Okay, we saw bishop f4, rook d7, and now we see queen a5, and white's again starting to feel a bit tied down to the structural issues. d5, a surprising move you might think, but one which the engine really quite likes here, dissolving, paradoxically, white's double pawns. Sometimes it's not enough for a visual weakness, you need exploitable weaknesses, so sometimes you don't mind pardon me, dissolving double pawns to get things like mighty knights. So c takes d5, and it's also of course robbing white of the bishop pair. We see the evaluation virtually coming down to equality now, but it looks visually as though black's doing better now. After bishop d2, c4, black is now technically better from an engine, even from the engine point of view. Without the bishop pair, with the bishop stuck behind its own pawn, now black's playing e5. Okay, it is a potential target on that e file. It is a structural issue in its own right as well. But, okay, what happens here? Black controls that d file very nicely. White just hasn't got the resources because he's tied down in other respects. Here, king h8. What was white actually threatening? Let's check, do a threat analysis. Bishop e1, not much in particular. Okay, so king h8 is an interesting waiting move that was played. Bishop e1. Okay. Now white is threatening possibly bishop h4 or queen b2. But this threat analysis assumes that the player we're checking has counterplay. We've also made the argument that white's counterplay has been significantly reduced already in this position. Black controls that d file, so you wouldn't expect too many threats on the horizon if we do have this true positional security that Nimzo-Indian has emphasized. The wider form of prophylaxis, positional security, means that slowly the opponent's threats will start to be extinguished. So that's what we should expect, less and less direct threats. What are white's good pieces here? The rooks are kind of discoordinated. Look at black's rooks. This is an aggressive looking piece, but it's not well supported. Knight e6. And black maybe have the threats like knight f4. This actually needs to be parried. It's not just about attacking the pawn. Knight f4 to d3 is a serious threat here. So bishop g3 just trying to parry that. Knight f4, and it's taken off here. Was knight f4 necessarily the best move? Well, e5 is under fire. e4 is another tactical opportunity, but I don't think we can quickly check it out. But it's just as good from an engine point of view as the move chosen. But it doesn't look as easy for a human to play as just playing knight f4. Knight f4 structurally seems to do a nice repair of black's only strategic structural liability, that e6 pawn on the semi-open file. So it's repairing that structural issue. Now we see this move rook d3. Okay, so rook d3. Why play rook d3? What is white potentially threatening here? Knight d4. Okay, and maybe the queen can be activated at some point, maybe to g6. So rook d3 stops the queen actually using this diagonal. Okay, and also now threatens queen takes f5, of course, blocking the queen's protection of the f5 knight. So rook e5. Now apparently here there's a tactical shot or two. Rook takes c3 might be possible. So is this a case of Mir again avoiding material considerations versus counterplay removal? That this kind of position might be more difficult to calculate. it's possible, even though he's snatched the pawn, that white has slightly more counterplay than would be desirable. Okay, or maybe not. Maybe sometimes Mir doesn't snatch material at the earliest possible moment. But is there any real need here? The move he plays, if it keeps some advantage, then a gradual escalation up that mountain to win the game is just going to result in a win, which is still a 1 on the scoreboard. It doesn't matter if it was played the most clinically driven way or a quiet, softly approach. So if this move simplifies, reduces white's counterplay a little bit more, and eventually gets there at the top of that mountain to win this game, then that's fine as well. So we see rook takes e5, getting rid of one pair of rooks. Okay, check. And now this move, king f1. Now what would really happen if king h1? Is it a total disaster? Yes, beautiful tactic here. If you're not spotting the engine moves here, okay, it's a bit difficult to ask you if you have. But the beautiful move here to exploit the back row will be queen b2. So this makes it clear that king h1 was totally impossible to play in this position, because queen b2, lovely exploitation, decoy. Let's check this again, of the back row. Okay, so queen b2, so king f1 virtually forced. Now we see the move queen d6, threatening the rook stumbles back. If queen e2 defending the rook, then this is a disaster, losing the queen. We'll be losing the queen surely to rook d2 if nothing else. But even stronger clinically is queen b6 first. Just winning the rook actually, even stronger. So forget that. So rook e1, so white is in a passive state. If he had played rook e2, does that seem plausible? Not really. Again, this diagonal is showing that it's a major weakness tactically. And the diagonal, if you remember, was when black played f5 and white played knight d2 to f3. It seemed like such a good idea, but these structural weaknesses later can be huge tactical targets as far as king safety is concerned. So the rook went back, and again, okay, king h7. An interesting move, king h7, and one which the engine likes. In fact, what is white actually threatening? White is threatening knight g6 check, of course, potentially. But no, we'll make sure. What is white's actual threat? Knight g6 and knight e5. Knight e5. That would attack the rook here. So this king h7 just stamps out knight g6. The king is also helping then. Reduce counterplay. And we've seen that in our previous Sultan Khan example game on this channel, that sometimes he's using the king itself to reduce counterplay of the opponent, which is a staggering concept, that your king is really involved in the middle game, reducing the possibilities, the dynamic possibilities of the opponent's pieces. But here it is stopping knight g6, very useful. Otherwise the knight could have been centralized and we'd see a completely different game result potentially if white got the counterplay. But no, the knight is kind of stuck here. Can it actually go to f5 in this position, you might ask? Dangerous. Queen a3, c3 is targeted. If white tries to defend, knight d5 now, c3 again targeted, and this knight can't move because of knight e3. This king is a massive liability here. This is a very big advantage for black, this position, just with the natural rook c1 here, natural but very passive. So king h7 really starts to squash the counterplay. From an engine point of view, interestingly, again, it's as though there's nothing, but from a human point of view, this is becoming a really easy position for black to play. Look at the domination of the d file. This knight's kind of stranded. White's being reduced to very passive looking moves. Queen b1. Now this queen b6 invitation is very interesting. Let's just make sure, just to make sure, that taking is no good. Okay, the access to the 7th rank, and under the Nimzo-Indian principle here, getting a rooks on the 7th, and this should be enough potentially for a win. So it was avoided by white. He wanted to keep the queens on. He plays queen c1, but now we see knight h5, not only defending but also some attacking implications as we've seen. So queen c2, Queen c5, and the threats are starting to emerge here. Although interestingly, it's as though something tactically dynamic was missing in White's play. What's this rook e6 about, for example? What would rook e6 be threatening? Rook c6 for rook c4 for trying to expose this d3 as a vulnerability? Possibly. So, but these kind of moves are not very human-like. Rook e6. It's a very tactical, dynamic move. What White played instead was just a feeble alternative, queen b1, and it leads to devastation. In fact, so here, if White wants to play on, in fact, rook e6 does at least get some coordination. And is there actually a major tactical idea on this pin then, sacrificing the knight? Could Black have tried this? For example, let's just give Black a token move. Rook c6, and if it takes, this would show the dynamism that White had available. But this isn't being exposed in the game, and now we can just use that pin. That'll be winning. So White didn't use this dynamic opportunity if it really represents something significant. If you think about it, Black has weakened squares around his king, light squares, and there is that pin, and it would be a way of celebrating that pin tactically to play rook e6 here, but it was missed. And instead, now the forcing sequences are all with Black, and it is a crushing blow, validated by the engineer. Knight g3 check. Hg, Fg, threatening mate, and there's no defence here. So from a stylistic perspective, this game is fascinating. It shows that maybe Nimzovich's My System was a great book about positional play, but it didn't mean that other top 10 players in the world weren't able to not only just play the Nimzo-Indian system, but play like Nimzovich himself. And in fact, in this very tournament, if there's interest, we can have a look at the encounter with Nimzovich himself. I think from a stylistic perspective, that might be quite interesting to check out. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.